Warning, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the producer and those appearing in the show and do not necessarily represent the views of DairyCam, the town of Derry, or any of its staff or affiliates. Hi, I'm Anthony Henry. Welcome back to America's Ask. We're on episode 61, and we got a really special show today because we're going to really focus in on one story. So, the person telling that story is Representative Ernesto Gonzalez. So, thank you for coming on. Please take a quick second to introduce yourself.
Yes, as Anthony just mentioned, my name is Ernesto Gonzalez, and I represent the city of Franklin, New Hampshire. And I've been invited to come and speak about my experiences, and I like to be able to be as open as possible about my particular story and to offer a warning out there to America because I believe we all need it.
All right, so Representative Gonzalez is an immigrant from Cuba. As if you're a history buff, you know that Cuba, when Fidel Castro took over, became dictatorship. It became really a wasteland. So I'm going to let him tell the story. He's going to tell his whole story in full. I'm really not going to talk much unless I have a question. I'll ask him. But yeah, it's story time today, so I'm excited. So start wherever.
Well, thank you. I am the son of Depression era parents. My mother was born in 1917, and my father was born in 1920. My mother has a lineage going back to Spain, and so does my father. And my grandmother was a Jewish French immigrant who gave birth to him in 1920, November 2nd to be exact. And my parents eventually met in 1948, got married in 1952, and I was born on July 1st, 1956, during the Batista administration. And my recognition or recognizance of this whole affair begins around 1960. About a year earlier, Fidel Castro had taken over power from Fulgencio Batista. He was often known as a dictator, but there's a lot more to the story than that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here, because I like to set the record straight, so to speak, as to what it was like before the revolution and what it has become since. And I like to start with the fact that Cuba was a great ally of the United States ever since it became a republic after the Spanish-American War of 1898. And we went through a succession of governments and a lot of turmoil. And I mentioned the fact that the Platt Amendment, which is known to many people out there, was instituted as a safeguard for the United States to be on guard if there were to be any civil unrest in Cuba. They had the obligation, the constitutional obligation to intervene to quell any uprisings or anything that could be perceived as a threat to the United States. And there were two interventions in 1906 and 1916. The original amendment was placed by Senator Orville Platt, and it stayed in power until 1934 when it was finally abrogated. Cuba went through several governments. The first administration under Stata Palma went well for two terms, and then things began to unravel. A lot of problems with corruption, problems with instability, and the corruption had to do with officials who became more interested in themselves than the people, and there came those two interventions in 1906 and 1916 because of it. In 1933 is where the story of Fulgencio Batista really begins. A former stenographer for the U.S. Alliance with the Cuban military became a sergeant who decided to intervene in what he saw as the deterioration of his country. And he decided to stage a coup on the constitutional government of Cuba and to rule under law and order, which was much needed. In 1934, about a year after he took over in a bloodless coup, he lobbied the U.S. administration for the removal of the Platt Amendment because he wanted Cuba to certainly be allied to the United States, but he wanted a certain degree of independence. He was a nationalist at heart with some socialist tendencies, but nothing of the socialist tendencies that we see today. It was mostly about programs for the people, pension plans, restructuring of the economy, the different sectors of society that needed organization that had been run by very corrupt people. So he ran as a dictator. If we use the term today, sounds very harsh. But in essence, he brought a lot of order from a lot of chaos. Subsequently, he was finally elected by the will of the people in 1940 and served for 4 years. Cuba's original government was very much like our own here in the United States, a 4-year term, an independent judiciary and executive judicial branches, the same as we have in the United States. So in 1934, he was successful in removing that Platt Amendment. And one of the great ironies of history is that that very amendment that he fought so much to remove himself from was the very thing that could have saved him and would have saved him in 1958 when Castro was on the verge of victory. Now, if we start with the revolution that he instituted, it was extremely successful the first time around. He retired in 1944, and he was cited as one of the most progressive, and not progressive in the modern sense, but in the sense of bringing about true progress to the island and reforming a lot of institutions that had been highly corrupted and become unusable for the population. He instituted a lot of social programs, and he was on good terms with Cuba's communist government, or Communist Party, I should say. But it was not a totalitarian government. It was more or less dealing with social issues and general welfare, but it was not political in the sense of interfering. He worked very well with them. And in 1944, once he finally left office after his term expired, he retired to Florida, and the administration of Carlos Prios Socarrás came into power. And by 1948, after 2 terms, the island had fallen again into disarray. A lot of corruption, an influx of the hard left had started to come into the country, and he decided, on behest of many of his former senators and government officials, to return to the island and to make a comeback. He did come back, became a senator, and eventually ran for office. He was to lose the 1952 election, and he instituted a second coup on March 3rd, 1952. This coup was also a bloodless coup, but this was not as welcomed as the one in 1933. The population had changed. The leftist influence had become much greater, and Fidel Castro began to be a part of the national scene, and he was running in the government in opposition to Batista. He called the coup an unconstitutional attempt to destroy the 1940 Constitution, and he created a lot of unrest towards his newly found presidency. And ultimately, he was the one who to bring down Batista in 1958, and there were a series of events that led to that, and I'd like to go over some of them. Fidel Castro, ironically, was a member of the upper classes. We once had a series of classes in in Cuba, much the way that you have it here in the States. They were an upper class, middle, lower middle, working, and the poor are always there, unfortunately. He was a member of the upper class. His father was a cattle rancher and a sugarcane harvester. And very early in life, he began to rebel against the tendencies of his father to become very pro United States, and he and his brother became separatists within the family movement. Castro would, in time, go to the University of Havana, attend some of the best high schools and general private schools, Jesuit schools in Havana. But he had an unfortunate accident in 1948, which many people say may have affected his ability to really function properly. He became very aggressive. He became very confrontational.
Similar to King Henry VIII of England. Many people point to his jousting accident as when he went off the rails. Yeah.
That is true. And he became very, very famous for being, again, a confrontational person, somebody who would love to argue for the sake of arguing and always wanted to win every single argument. In school, he was known as, if there's something to discuss, whether it was relevant or not, he was going to oppose it. He had that kind of personality. He also developed a reputation as a thug, because he got involved in many underground organizations within Cuba to uproot the opponents of what would be the Communist Party in years to come, the totalitarian Communist Party. He finally graduated from the University of Havana, which happened to be one of the most coveted universities in Latin America and the Caribbean, certainly, for many years. And he decided to challenge Batista in 1952 as a member of Congress, and he probably would have gained a seat in Cuba's system, but he wanted to make a real impression as a protest towards Batista's illegal taking of power. So on July 26th of 1952, he staged what was called, you could call it an insurrection. He attacked Moncada's barracks, which was a fortress in eastern Cuba and in the province of Oriente. And it was a suicide attempt by about 100 men that he sent. And of course, he didn't go in himself. And they were all slaughtered, and him and his brother wound up escaping. And he was captured, went on trial. In his 1953 trial, he gave a very long speech in defense of the Constitution, in defense of the working class, in defense of the poor, the farmers. Just what people wanted to hear, a return to some kind of democracy that was missing. And he happened to have a sympathizer in Cuba's judicial system who influenced the other judges, and also received quite a bit of influence from the Catholic Church, because he was about to receive the death penalty for insurrection and treason. So in exchange, they gave him and his brother 15 years of prison. However, by 1955, Batista made the decision that would forever change his life and the life of the country. He decided to have a political amnesty for all prisoners, not only those who had been captured during the Moncada barracks, but also other opposition members, in order to create some kind of coalition to discuss in a democratic fashion the future of Cuba. Well, Castro, being the opportunist that he always was, immediately disappeared with his brother and went to Mexico to train in guerrilla counterinsurgency, and was thoroughly trained in guerrilla warfare. In 1956, December 3rd, 1956, he landed secretly with about 100 men off the shores of Oriente province in eastern Cuba, not far from Guantanamo Bay. And Batista was waiting for him. The ambush had leaked, but he escaped again. Him and his brother escaped into the mountains of eastern Cuba, which are really impenetrable and not fitting for a conventional army, which is what Batista's army was, primarily supplied by U.S. Equipment, armaments. It was a thoroughly trained army, but in a conventional sense. It was not trained in guerrilla warfare. And in 1957, Che Guevara joined the insurgents, and he was an Argentinian. Many people don't know this, but he was an Argentinian member of the hard left who entered Cuba with a fake passport and a disguise, and found himself in the mountains of eastern Cuba. And he's widely recognized as the person who helped radicalize the mostly nationalist forces in the mountains of eastern Cuba, the opposition to Batista's government, and to a Marxist-Leninist background. And Fidel was known to read Marxist literature during his time in the University of Havana. So between Castro's influence, Che Guevara's influence, and Raul's influence, many members of the resistance became radicalized, and there was a wide division between those who looked for a more democratic, more prosperous, more aligned properly with the United States, and those who wanted a complete break in a communist style similar to that of the Soviet Union. And Castro embarked himself in a propaganda campaign for about 2 years, using shortwave radio and being able to get to the people of the country, which was at the time about 6 million people, and to broadcast his message of change. And it's found here, one of his only letters that made it to America, in this magazine called Coronet Magazine, which was considered a far-left magazine by 1950 standards. And this is the 1958 edition of it. And it has two stories. Why We Fight, by Fidel Castro, leader of Cuba's revolution. He didn't want to call himself a communist. He didn't. Every time he was asked, he said no. And there is a short 2-minute clip on YouTube where he's asked in 1956 by Herbert Matthew, a member of the correspondence team of the New York Times, whether or not he was a communist. And he says it quite plainly, twice. We are not communists. We have no Marxist-Leninism in our ideology. We're for land reform and good relations. That was the end of it. However, America was very leery of his statements and of the reports that were coming into the Eisenhower administration. But still, what Eisenhower didn't realize that he was being undermined by his own government. And subsequently, they helped, especially the lower echelons of the State Department and those of the anti-American Caribbean affairs, to undermine Batista and to raise Castro to the level of a hero. There was an interview that Fidel Castro gave in 1956 where he called for an American correspondent to come to the mountains of eastern Cuba, and this is where this video where he says he's not a communist was filmed. Herbert Matthew was a well-known leftist in the New York Times, and the whole idea was to just give him a platform to speak from, and that made him a national hero. And also, the following Sunday, there was a full expose of Fidel Castro as a modern-day Robin Hood, who would come in and break apart the dictatorship and bring about a real revolution of the people and for the people. And that lie kept being perpetuated. And even in this 1958 article of the letter that he wrote and the interview that he gave 2 years later, he still does not speak about his Marxist-Leninist ties. It wasn't until later in 1958 when he was assured of victory. And that was partly assured, unfortunately, by the American government in 1957, cutting off all arms shipments to Cuba, which was also a violation of the 1947 Rio Treaty. But it was already decided that Batista would go and Castro would take over, and there would be peace on the island because it was on the verge of another civil war. And this time, the Plan Amendment was not there to intervene.
And a few years later would be Bay of Pigs during the Kennedy administration here in America.
Yes. In a famous book, which has been reprinted, it's called The Fourth Floor by the last Cuban diplomat or the last American diplomat to represent the United States in Cuba. His name was Earl E.T. Smith. It's called The Fourth Floor. And in it, he talks about all the behind the scenes moves that were made in order to bring Castro into power. And there's a very important conversation that he has with Batista near the end, around November, December 1958. And he pretty much told him what Batista knew already, that he had lost the support of the people, and the United States favored Castro over him. He says, I know that I'm no longer supported. But he said, he made a statement that would forever be remembered by those who study history. And it was very simply, if you think I'm a bad guy, just wait till the guy who's coming after me. Then you'll really find out. And, well, on December 31st, 1958, Batista abdicates, leaves with his family and some of his high member cabinets and members of the military, and goes to Florida. And Castro takes over on January 1st, 1959. And within the first 2 weeks of taking over, the mass executions began.
And during this time, you were young. You were only a few years old.
So it was about three and a half years old.
So now is when your story kind of begins about growing up right as all this was starting to happen.
Yes, my earliest memories began in 1960 at the age of 4. But I was a child of the Cold War, and I remember the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961. I remember the ex-soldiers, Brigade 2506, that was being trained in Guatemala. And the whole Bay of Pigs has been called a fiasco, and it was. It was very poorly arranged by the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy inherited it. He did not want to do it, but he gave in to his generals and went ahead with a flawed plan. Furthermore, a few short months before the attack in April of 1961, correspondent Tad Zalsk of the New York Times leaked out the information that there was a group of CIA insurgents in Guatemala being prepared for an attack. And Kennedy is recorded as slamming the paper in his office on the carpet and saying, what good is it to have a covert operation if Castro can read it on the cover of the New York Times? But he went ahead with it anyway, because we need to remember that in 1960, still there was that air of invincibility about everything we did. America never does anything wrong, doesn't make mistakes.
At that point, we hadn't yet gotten in Vietnam, which was our first real loss in terms of war. So
he had started as early as in 1961 and 62 to send advisors in, which is always the way it starts.
Yeah.
But the original plan is discussed by two of the top generals who were in charge of the operation, in which the plans were revealed in a 1995 interview. It was for these 1,400 men to land at the Bay of Pigs and attempt to establish a beachhead within 48 hours of landing. And if that failed, it was promised that the full might of the U.S. military would come in and save the day. That wasn't revealed for decades later. Kennedy orders an airstrike to prepare the landing and destroys half of Castro's air force, but then changes his mind and he leaves them without any support. Castro was waiting for them. They had World War II planes, World War II or older cargo planes, I should say cargo ships with ammunition and food and medicine. All these things were blown out the water. So essentially the 1,400 men were left stranded, and calls for help went unaided. And Kennedy was receiving the very first challenge of his administration. What do I do now? Because he wanted it to be a covert operation, as he called it. We don't want the American footprint to be placed on it. But it was very poorly managed. It lasted about a week, less than a week. Ammunition was depleted. There was no food. No medicine. No help coming in from the U.S. military, and U.S. warships were right at the edge of the territorial waters, and they could see in the distance a lot of what was going on, and they wanted to intervene, but they could not supersede the authority of the president. It must have been a very difficult moment to see people getting slaughtered, or you see the fires and all the explosions that were going on and not being able to intervene. So Kennedy wound up with a dilemma in his hands. What do we do now? And Castro's golden moment, we have given America a symbolic black eye. And he loved to do that. That was one of his favorite pastimes, to just make America look bad. So out of the 1,400, approximately 800 of them survived. And they were in his prisons, and Cuba's prisons are real prisons. They're not the prisons that we hear about, as terrible as some of the ones are. We're talking about gulag type of prisons, where prisoners could be executed at any given time without trial, without cause. There are several eyewitness accounts of people who survived the camps, how they would come into their cells, and for fun, they would just pick somebody to kill for the night. It was just a complete psychological horror, as well as subpar food. Uwe Matos, who was one of his top generals, speaks about how when he was arrested in 1959 for not wanting to round up people for executions, mass graves were there, and he didn't want any of that in his province, Camagüey province, and he signed a letter of resignation as the governor of Camagüey province. Was a former teacher. He said, "I wish to return to my civilian life, and I'd like to no longer be part of this government." So Castro interpreted that as treason, and at a particularly difficult time in the revolution, where there was already an underground movement against Castro going on. This is something a lot of people don't know about, because they were starting to realize that they had exchanged one style of dictatorship to a much more dangerous one. But Castro had ordered the arrest of thousands of people who would have joined the rebellion before the Bay Pigs, because he had noticed that it would happen. He was very tactical about everything. So now Kennedy has to somehow, as they say, save face. And how do you do that? There was really no way out. Now, we've been following the news in the last year, 2 years, with this Gaza conflict, and there's now hostage crisis and exchanges. Castro gave Kennedy a proposition. Says, you want your 800 men back? It's going to cost you. I mean, if you do the math, I think it was $68 million in 1962. Would be in 2024 dollars, if you could make the transaction. Some people say it's in the billions of dollars. Billions. So he paid $68 million for the hostage release and an unlimited amount of medical and food supplies because the stockpiles were emptying out from the former regime, and the new regime nationalized just about everything. So production levels plummeted. The country realized that now they were in the midst of a new dictatorship, although he still had a very strong following going out to the Bay of Pigs. So Kennedy makes the deal. He welcomes them at the Orange Bowl in Miami. But as you can imagine, there was a lot of bitterness in the 2506 Brigade, realizing that they had been betrayed. And the promise that was made to them had never been fulfilled. And for Castro, it was a great, great victory. And also the beginning of his alliance with the Soviet Union.
And at this point, what's going on in your house? I imagine, I'd say you're about 10 years away from when you fled or so, give or take. And what's going on in your house at this point?
Well, there was a great division, not so much with my own parents. My mother was an early supporter, but she came around rather quickly. My father always talked about how he was a communist and he was not going to bring anything good to the island. And I was immersed in this whole Cold War narrative between television, listening secretly to the Voice of the Americas, which was heavily jammed by the Cuban government. I used to listen to it at night. I remember listening to the 1964 elections, and I became a political child of the 1960s. But there was great division in the family. One side went pro-Castro, the other side went anti-Castro. And when we think about what happened in the last several years with the COVID divisions and people spying on each other and the controversy and so on, it was a terrible thing because Hispanic communities are, as a whole, are very close knit societies. We value the family. We used to have a weekly meeting where all the members of the family would meet at my grandmother's house. My grandmother became a member of the party, and all that cohesion disappeared within a few short years. At school, I was branded as a traitor. They used to call us worms, and that was right after the Bay of Pigs is when the harassment began to really come about. I do recall an incident in 1961 where a member of Cuba's secret police in Germany was the Stasi, there was the G2. And I remember them coming to my school and talking to our class and saying to us, it is your patriotic duty to tell on anyone, even your own members of the family, of your family, who speaks ill of the revolution.
And so many connections you could make to other points of history.
It is. Yeah. It is. Talk about the Soviet Union. We can talk about many other situations. But I believe God gave me the wisdom and the insight to stay silent. There were children who actually betrayed their families, and people went to prison for it, which, again, is not uncommon if you follow the Soviet model. And right afterwards, we filed for exit visas, which was still available in 1962, and I do remember I still have the passports, all three passports, and it is dated September 17th, 1962. But we took our photos, we were ready to leave, but something happened in October of 1962, which would change history, and that was the October Missile Crisis. And he used that as an opportunity to cancel any and all exits. If you want to run a quick parallel, think of what was happening in East Germany around the same time in West Germany. It was being divided. The Berlin Wall was being created. First, it was just barbed wire. People jumping from top of buildings over to the west side and so on. And the first exodus came from the upper class. Those who had property, those who had wealth, but they had to leave it all behind. Years and years of hard labor to gain wealth, prosperity, and a free market society. It was all gone. Lawyers, doctors, astrophysicists, all kinds of professionals were leaving. But Castro, seeing what was happening in the Eastern and Western German conflict, he didn't want the same thing to happen to Cuba. He was losing his so-called brain thrust. But we were no longer part of the elite group. We were just a working class family. But we had no way out. And we knew it. I remember asking my mother if we were going to get blown out the water in 1962. I was 6. And it's, a, it's a very harrowing experience to be a 6-year-old and wondering now whether or not you're going to live or die. And the split began to widen among family members. One of the family members became an active member in the Cuban Communist Party's militia. That's what they used to call it in the early days of militia. They didn't have yet an actual police. It was all the militia and the secret police. He established something again which is very Soviet-like. They called it Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, which were secret organization of loyal party members, and in Havana were mostly high-rises. They would establish them within each one of those high-rises, and their role was to spy on their neighbors. And fortunately, we had one that was just a token one. She said, you just do what you need to do. I'm not going to bother you. But it wasn't that case for many. Think of the psychological terror of not knowing. You can't speak openly in the streets. They could just turn you over. And imagine being given the penalty of guilty before being declared guilty. Its trials became a sham, and he destroyed as many members of the opposition as he could. In the meantime, we were wondering, what are we going to do after the missile crisis? So it would be until 1966, so a 4-year period ensued. In 1966, President Lyndon Johnson passed the Cuban Adjustment Act, which allowed us to enter the United States as political refugees, providing we had a sponsor here in the States. My mother had a sister who had come to the United States in 1948 and became a citizen in 1952, so she was eligible to claim us, so she was able to claim us. Now, in those days, when we used to have a real immigration system, it was the responsibility of the family to take care of those members whom they sponsored. So they did. And, but, we lived the immigrant experience. After staying at their home for about 3 months and, for the first time watching something which to me was completely magical. I had just turned 12 years old, 4 days before I left on July. Well, we were told in April of 1968 that we were leaving. And my father was sent to a concentration camp, high labor, where he had soldiers with rifles pointed at him all the time. He told me stories. I mean, he came home like he just came out of a toaster. He was so fried by the sun. At times, sleeping in hammocks, he recalls stories of scorpions running up and down his body and not being able to move so he wouldn't get stung. I mean, it was a real horrible period. And for me, I was wondering, what's going on with my father. And my mother was always having nerve attacks, as he used to call them in those days. And I was kind of a troublesome youth on top of it all, because just imagine, as I say, you're busy growing up, and then you have to deal with all this political pressure on top of it, and school pressure, everything else. So I became very aggressive. I became a bit of a school lawyer trying to defend people who I felt were being unjustly treated by the party, and consequently got expelled from school in 1964 at the age of 8. And I was put under observation for 2 years because I was considered unmanageable and antisocial, because I would not follow. Oh, there was also what we have here as the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, if they still even really exist. They had their whole new system called and they have it in the Soviet Union as well, and in the former Soviet countries, called the Pioneers, the Young Pioneers. They would have the shorts and the neckerchiefs, and it was basically like the German youth. Same thing, but they were just sponges for propaganda, for communist propaganda. And as a child, I wanted to join because as a child, you want to be accepted, you want to be part of a group. But the realization came in, if I ever joined such an organization, it would be the end of our opportunity to leave. Also, and this is something that got my mother quite nervous, was that in Cuba, once you turn 15 years old, you have to serve in the military for 7 years. 15. You have to serve for 7 years. And if you do serve in the military, they consider you a security risk, so you're never allowed to leave. And the clock was ticking as I was turning 12. And my mother was wondering, when is it going to happen? It's kind of like the Mission Impossible music playing in the background. And finally, later in April of 1968, we received the definite notice. I still remember we were given numbers. And our number was 103,912. That was our number. My father wrote it on the patio wall. And when our number came up, they had to send a member of the military to our home to take an inventory of everything we owned. Because after all, traders do not have a right to hold on to anything. So we had to leave everything behind. Refrigerators, TVs, you couldn't sell anything. And we were warned. So I was there the day when it happened. Because if you move anything that is on this list that I'm taking from the inventory, and if we do an audit of your apartment and something's missing, that could be grounds for us not allowing you to leave. So again, there's that psychological warfare going on.
Like, are we going to be able to actually leave?
Yes.
Yeah.
And my mother, I have to say, she was a tremendous leader. She was the one who approached my aunt. My father was your traditional breadwinner, but he did not want to get involved with anything having to do with politics. And he wanted to leave. He didn't see a way out, but my mother saw a way out, and she just pursued the pathways towards it. And she wound up hiding her wedding ring from the inspector. Tremendously risky move to make. And she wound up selling it for 50 pesos, which is nothing. And that's what paid our cab fare from Havana to Matanzas province, where the airport was. But we spent 3 months, the wealthy part of the family, which at the time was allowed to hold on to their businesses. See, when Castro came in, he nationalized well over 95% of the economy. In early 1959, he took over all the oil refineries in Cuba, which were American-owned. Again, think of the numbers. Over $2 billion in 1959 of U.S. property was confiscated and never, ever, ever compensated for in the States. Just let it happen.
Yeah.
$2 billion in 1959. And he used the excuse that they did not want to refine Soviet crude. But we're not doing it, so we're an American company. We have a right to say no. It's fine. We're taking over. So he fired the engineers and he took over the refineries, ruined most of the equipment because Soviet crude was extremely crude, and it ruined a lot of the state-of-the-art at the time equipment that we had in Cuba. And then, of course, anyone that had a private practice, doctors, lawyers, all of that was gone. And when they came into this country, None of the credentials were honored. People had to go back to college, learn the language, get the certifications, get your degrees back, get everything back. So our story is one of the real immigrant story. Now, I was still a child. I just turned 12 years old. I'm talking primarily of those who left in the very early 60s and very late 50s. But we lived in Miami, Florida, and you can't even call it an apartment. It was a 3-room wooden hut with a roof part partially caving in. 3 people in one room, just like you read in the stories about the old Irish immigrants and the early immigrants of the 20th century and late 19th century. We lived in that kind of situation. 3 people in one room. The only thing about the place was that there was an air conditioner going on 24/7. That kept us alive. But it's Florida, and if you ever lived in Florida, you know there are a lot of crawling things. And so our house became killing fields or anything that got in, mostly rats and frogs and anything else. It was a very, very difficult time. My father had to take whatever job he could get, and he was working for a whole $1.50 an hour at the Eden Rock Hotel in Miami Beach, washing pots, or working construction, doing whatever he could. But he told my mother, "You take care of him. I will take care of providing for the house." And we were paying $70 a month for rent. $70 a month for rent, and that was still not cheap money in 1968 for rent. And we were threatened by the slumlord, said, "If you ever turn me into the Board of Health, I will have you kicked out of here." Where were we going to go? There were no government programs to help us. There was nothing. But that also brought within me the sense of just having to survive, learning how to survive. Starting school in the fall of 1968, learning subjects in a foreign language, foreign culture, foreign everything. And I was just told, just go in there after about a month and a half of some basic English and learn with everybody else. So I had to teach myself the language. I had to teach myself how to read, how to do all these things, which is very typical of the immigrants of that period and earlier. So when you see today how differently we were treated, and we've been called one of the most productive immigrant groups to come into this country over the last century, because we came here with a very strong work ethic, and it was not about. And as a school teacher, which I am, and I tell my students, I will forever be thankful to the United States for allowing me to come into this country, allowing us to come into this country, because it did not have to do that. See, immigration is not a right, it's a gift. And we were very aware of that, and we were very thankful. And I've told my students many times that as long as I live, I will always be thankful for being adopted into the great American story. It is not an easy one. It was not an easy one. And it was a long road. I wound up leaving Florida in 1970, and then we went to Massachusetts. No one spoke Spanish in 1970 Boston.
Yeah, it was all Irish at the time, Irish and Italian.
And Italian is.
And where where do you think the similarities are between your story and current America? Because in the introduction, you said that your story is really a cautionary tale. Where do you think the caution lies in 2025 United States?
Well, as far as the immigration part, we need to know who's entering our country. Because now with the new administration, things are changing. But we had 4 years of an open border. And when you have an open border, you really don't have the time to process hundreds and thousands of people getting through your border. And they were not just coming from South and Central America. They were coming from all over the world. We probably read stories and watched it on television. And this country has decidedly moved to the left over the last 60 years. And I believe that this election was a crucial election we just had. Had we lost this election, we may have lost the country.
Similar to that moment you talked about in Cuba.
And now being part of local government, state government, I consider a further opportunity to give. Because it's not about taking. It's easy to take, but it's harder to give. Again, it's the old Kennedy maxim. It's not what you can advocate for you.
Country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
That is our belief. And I'm not saying we're alone at this. There are other groups that have come, but the so-called ethos of immigration has changed tremendously over the last several years. We were talking earlier about the 1980, and I tell this to my students, just you don't think that I'm anti-immigration. In 1980, for those of you who still remember, President Carter allowed 125,000 Cubans to arrive from the Mariel port in Cuba, hailed as political heroes. But Castro did one of his usual maneuvers, and he emptied up his prisons and his mental institutions and threw him in with the regular folk. Sound familiar? And there was white outrage. If you remember the period, the crime was rampant in Florida in particular. I remember one particular situation when a Cuban gang of hardened prisoners took over the maximum security prison in Georgia. Now, Castro knew what he was doing, obviously, and the Carter administration, at least, is one of the few good things that he did, in my view. Expelled him and sent him back, and being sent back is certain death. But I use that as an example that I'm not trying to look at this from an elitist point of view. Is that we need to know who's entering our country. We were vetted as we were coming in. We had to go through a system. And right now, there's cells all over this country that could plan another 9/11. And who would have ever thought? I mean, I was teaching at Medford High School the day that it happened. I remember hearing a member of the faculty come and did you just watch on TV what happened? I had a television in my room at the time. And that was another one of those moments in history that will never be forgotten. And it probably could have been avoided, like most disasters. Well, who's to say that something just as horrific cannot happen? We have a lot more infiltration in this country than ever before.
So, with the last couple minutes that we have, what is your, I guess, closing statement?
Well, I think we need to remain vigilant. And if we truly love what this country stands for, yes, and it has flaws like any country, but if we stand by the ideals from which this country was originally founded upon and stay faithful to it, we can not only save the present, but save the future generations to come. And as long as I am on this planet, I will always fight for this country, whether it's in the political scene or in the schools, wherever I see injustices. And I will not give in to the crowd, the mob, or the ideology that is bent on destroying the American dream and American society at large.
Well, thank you very much for coming on and telling your story. It is an important story, a story that I think a lot of people need to hear. And one more thing before we end, just your reminder, because we have, I believe, 2 weeks to go. The local election here in Derry is March 11th. You can register to vote from now until March 1st. Voting registration will then close until the day of the election. And then polls are open at the Hackler Gym at Pinkerton from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. If you saw last episode and if you follow Derry at all, you know what's on the line here. So get out and vote. Local elections are often overlooked.
Yes, and make sure that you do vote. And we need to also have great oversight over our voting system. We cannot allow another 2020.
We cannot. All right. I am Anthony Henry. This has been America's Ass. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Good night.